So we're going to look at action learning, action research in action. And we're going to discuss a real live example that I personally was involved in at Children's Hospital, Colorado. What's interesting about this case is it started as action learning and became action research. We ended up writing a paper about it that was recently published. That paper is an optional reading for you if you want to understand a little bit more context and more methodology than what we'll discuss here. Upon completing this module, you will be able to identify an application of action learning, action research within an organizational setting, illustrate where theory and application intertwine and diverge in the Children's Hospital example, and assess the utility of action learning, action research for this OD intervention. So first, a little background about Children's Hospital Colorado. It was founded in 1908, 16 locations across the Denver metro area, Colorado Springs and Pueblo, over 13,600 inpatient admissions, and over 19,000 surgeries in 2012. Over 545,000 outpatients, 512 licensed beds, about 5,200 employees, and 1,500 medical staff. Children's Hospital Colorado has been recognized in a number of ways. We are one of the top 10 children's hospitals in the country. We are Magnet certified. That's a designation through the American Nurses Credentialing Center. And then we are also one of Parents Magazine's 10 best children's hospitals, number 5 in the nation, and actually the most patient-friendly hospital in the country. So let me provide you a little context regarding Children's Hospital Colorado. We went through significant transformation from a period of 2006 through actually ongoing now. We relocated from downtown Denver to Aurora in 2007, actually in September 2007. We increased our square footage almost threefold and recently added an East Tower addition back in last year in 2012. And we're actually building a new South Campus in 2013 in the South Metro area, which will have some inpatient beds. There was significant leadership retirement and transition that occurred. Our long-standing CEO retired, and we brought in a new person in 2007 in January so that he can get a flavor of the old building before we moved. We had tremendous operating revenue growth of 67% in a 5-year period. And 60% of the employees were new to the organization in 2012 since 2007. And most of that was growth, plus some turnover. But the turnover was actually not the big issue. It was really the growth. The network of care, which were other sites that provided outpatient services and some inpatient services, added further staff and dispersed staff and challenged us culturally to keep things consistent and aligned. And then we had an off-site meeting where we asked leaders if they could identify the organization's values, and only 2 of them could. And so a concern that I had as the head of human resources is the fear of cultural fragmentation, that what was the glue other than the mission, but did we have glue holding us together and making Children's Hospital cohesive and aligned? So with this concern of cultural fragmentation in mind, we set about gathering some data and confirming, is there something going on here that requires our intervention? Comments from open-ended questions within the Employee Opinion Survey, the annual Employee Opinion Survey, were analyzed to identify themes and emergent issues related to behaviors that were incongruent with our espoused values. So basically, what was it like at our worst? Then we conducted an interview process referred to as culture rounding, and that was implemented to gather qualitative data on the perception of these behaviors. We wanted to really see, are there things going on that are counter to our espoused values? So the data from over 1,000 interviews were captured and synthesized into thematic categories and communicated back to management. These interviews included anecdotes of increasing internal incivility. And staff expressed their concerns in phrases such as, "we used to be like a family," we're becoming too corporate, or we're losing our soul. And these sentiments were perceived as indicators of cultural drift and were interpreted as a threat to the hospital's ability to fulfill its mission because they represented a surrender of purpose and suggested an erosion of organizational cohesion. So once we gathered the data, we were really looking at the theoretical framework of the role of values in culture change. So we made an assumption that values are an important part of culture, and that if the values fragmented, it put the culture at risk of further fragmentation. We then looked at this theoretical framework and said, how do we go about approaching this, gathering data and potentially having an intervention? And we looked at action learning as the methodology, which was we were going to engage others in the process of addressing this situation. And through them, we would utilize appreciative inquiry and Theory U, which is by an author named Otto Scharmer. But action learning was critical because we know that in order to change the organization, it was going to need to come from within, not from human resources telling people what to do or creating the intervention as the expert. So what we actually did is individual representatives were selected. They were nominated as those people who best represented the values of the organization. And this happened in a big management meeting. So they were actually nominated and selected that way. They then were part of this team that set about looking at this more carefully. Defined by Shine, culture is what a group learns over a period of time as that group solves its problems of survival in an external environment and its problems of internal integration. The values of an organization there are based on the underlying assumptions, therefore, and central to the ability of the organization to solve problems and survive in its external environment. Dennison described the importance of values as the fundamental basis for coordinated action within an organization and directly connected values to organizational effectiveness. Shine identified 3 levels central to culture change efforts: observable artifacts, values, and basic underlying assumptions. Strategies for the intervention that could impact all 3 levels were sought out. Organizations can use a variety of methods to identify shared values and underlying assumptions, such as surveys, but Shine suggested that interview and observation methods, working with motivated insiders of an organization, can bring the underlying assumptions to the surface, which is what we intended in the project. In this case, the approach that was chosen was one in which the existing basic assumptions that were suited to the current challenges would be identified through interview and observation methods called listening sessions. These were conducted by a cross-functional group of these insiders representing different parts of the organization. These insiders were the ones nominated by leadership. The information would then be shared in a newly formulated values statement, which would be an artifact that the organization could refer to. In addition, the stories gathered in the process would be shared broadly, thereby creating another set of artifacts which would reinforce the new assumptions and espouse values. And finally, the collaborative way in which the value statement was created would be shared as an example of the organization living its values. So this concept of action learning was critical. And in this way, the 3 levels of the intervention would reinforce one another. That was the thinking. We turned to action learning from Revens, who was credited with developing the concept of action learning. And it really set out to solve practical or real problems in a social process of collective learning that outlives the original problem. And this situation clearly fit that. It's also defined as a process and tool that enable individuals and groups to learn while solving problems and implementing action. So we kind of used to say that the intervention is the process and the process is the intervention. And it entrusts small groups to work on practical problems, to problem solve and learn as an outcome. And it reinforced a value that we thought was critical for our institution as we go forward. Core to the underlying concepts of appreciative inquiry is the role of the inquiry itself. The team struggled at first with the idea that the work should focus on the positive core of children. The team raised questions about whether this appreciative focus would shut off dialogue or even if it was unrealistic. These concerns became stronger when participants in some of the learning sessions chose to express frustration instead of sharing stories of children's at its best. They were reminded that asking the right questions determines what is discovered. The story that Children's was losing touch with its positive core was already gaining strength, and focusing on negative stories could reinforce that belief. But the team struggled and debated on how to handle the negative stories they were hearing, but by returning to the theory, appreciative inquiry, they were able to gain confidence in their approach. They became capable of holding space for the frustration, but were able to return to the search for the positive core that motivated the work. So appreciative inquiry in this collaborative effort was critical to keep things focused on positive while acknowledging the negative. One thing I want to clarify is that my role was that of corporate sponsor. It was our people development department, made up of professional OD and training people, that facilitated the process with the interdisciplinary team, utilizing these different theories. Another theory that they tapped into along with appreciative inquiry was Otto Scharmer's Theory U. It's quite a large book, and it's available if you look it up. Quite interesting in that it describes a process for initiating attention and intention to situation analysis and problem solving. It engages individuals or groups in techniques to shift from existing mental models to broader openness in seeing emergent possibilities. So the idea was to get out of the existing mental model. If you're going to re-articulate your values, we needed to be very open in thinking about that. And when you have employees that are very vetted and believe in the best, the facilitators wanted to ensure their openness to a different way of thinking about it. So here's a copy of our previous value statement, one that had been updated, I think, a few years before we undertook the project. And it involved a fairly basic corporate-sounding kind of statement: quality patient care and safety, customer service, innovation, employee excellence, and family-centered care. And when Paul Wyman, our Director of People Development, came to me and said, we might be looking at this very differently, he actually suggested it could come in the form of poetry or a song. And I remember wincing and saying, Paul, I will trust whatever process you and the team come up with. Although secretly I was very concerned about our credibility with the board of directors. So let me read you what the team came up with. And it reflects back to some history and some forward thinking. And they also took values and paired them, which was unique. So for a child's sake, we are a caring community called to honor the sacred trust of our patients, families, and each other through humble expertise, generous service, and boundless creativity. This is the moment. So as you can tell, quite different from a more traditional corporate-sounding values statement. And this was really to be used as one artifact to help move the culture, as we continue to expand and grow and fragment. This was to be a unifying creed that tipped our hat to the past, for a child's sake, had been a historic phrase, and then these paired pieces, and then this is the moment, which is action-oriented. So you may wonder what happened. Well, the values group rolled this out, including to our senior leadership and to our board of directors, and they did not make any changes. They really allowed the group to keep the creed as they constructed it. And the values group has now become what we call a staff experience team to help roll it out and socialize it throughout the organization. We are also beginning to link the value statement to behavioral standards. We had a set of behavioral standards that we've used in our performance management process, but it didn't really link to our values in the past. Now we're trying to align all of these components, from the values to our behavioral standards to performance and hiring, etc., along kind of these values. So we did question, did we miss something? The issue for quality and safety has come up, and I must admit that at times I wonder if that should have been in the statement and if it is worth revisiting. And then the other thing is, it was difficult to measure the effectiveness. It's been about a year, a little over a year, since the values statement was reconstituted. And although it has taken shape, it's now finally on our website. It took about 9 months for it to become more visible, and it still isn't particularly visible throughout the hospital. So the effort, to me, was undertaken. The process was successful. The involvement of people in the institution was very robust, but we still have a ways to go in terms of its impact for culture change. So I hope this was a useful example of how we utilized action learning and action research in an organizational context. And it's not a super clean process. It was very emergent, and I think that is the nature of some of these action learning, action research projects. Clearly, this is a fairly fast summary of the entire project, and if you want to learn more, I'd encourage you to watch the video interview with Ryan Simmons and Paul Wyman, and the article is available as well.